Calibration. Calibration is when you actually make an adjustment to the instrument that you're using to make measurements with. Verification is when you verify that the instrument is operating within the limits. Another term is the term certification. Usually that's talking about getting a certificate from the manufacturer of your transfer standards or wherever you get them recalibrated. And the certificate shows that they are operating within parameters, that they've been calibrated, and what standard the calibrating authority, like the manufacturer or the weights and measures laboratory, what standard they're using to calibrate your field instrument. And that certificate, generating that certificate, is called certification. So that term is usually used with your transfer standards, talking about how often they need to be recertified. Now, in some cases, you can do that depending upon what parameters and what instruments you're using. In general, calibration is required annually. Sometimes calibration is not required unless an instrument fails verification. In other words, it's not operating within limits, or for some other reason, like you have to move it or it's been shipped, then calibration is often called for. But of course, if you're making measurements to determine if some parameter in your environment meets a standard, then usually that standard will have associated documentation for the requirements for QA. Sometimes that doesn't exist, and then you need to research how well most instruments do and try to meet the requirements that are usually expected for measuring that parameter. Remember, verification is when you verify that your instrument is operating within limits. And when we talk about, say, doing a 2-point or a 5-point verification, that means you take 5 different points on the line that goes from 0 to higher concentrations. Or if you're talking about flow rate, measuring how well your field instrument compares against flow rate or some other parameter like temperature or pressure measured by a handheld transfer standard. So this section has to discuss 2 kinds of calibrations. One are the calibrations that your field instruments undergo and whatever the requirements are for those. Then you also have to consider your flow rate transfer standards, your temperature transfer standards, those sometimes handheld standards that you compare against your field instrument. Those also have to be verified and calibrated, a lot of times annually. In most cases, the manufacturer will do that for you. A lot of programs have 2, or maybe you can borrow a standard if you don't get yours back from getting calibrated before you have to use it again. This section has to talk about how frequently and what the requirements are for calibrating your field instruments, as well as the requirements that you need to make sure your transfer standards meet, because they also have to get checked and sometimes recalibrated. If you are taking samples in the field, then it may not be that this section is going to be very long for you, because the laboratory conducting the analyses of what you sample in the field, they have to have their calibration system. However, remember that you are responsible for the validity of these measurements. You contract with the laboratory to perform measurements according to some procedure, and that procedure has limits. A lot of times, if it's an EPA standard method, there's a full description of that online on the EPA website, and you can get their requirements from that description. In any case, if you are gathering samples in the field, then it may be that the equipment that you use to gather the samples with, if you're gathering samples of a particular volume, then you need to get that calibrated, or you need to standardize your procedures as much as possible, and pretty much all the calibration is done at the laboratory. And if that's the case, this section is going to be pretty small. Remember, you have to state the requirements in this quality assurance project plan. You should be able to reference SOPs for calibrating any equipment that you use, that you attach, and then this section can have a table that summarizes the requirements for calibrating your field instruments, as well as for calibrating your transfer standards, those handheld instruments that you use to periodically check the performance of your field instruments.